On the night of April 1, 2012, the streets of Suwon, South Korea were quiet, as if the city itself had gone to sleep. But behind this calm, something terrifying was about to unfold, something that would not only shatter one life but shake an entire nation. At exactly 10:50 p.m., a woman's trembling voice broke through the silence. She had called 112, the police emergency number, gasping for breath, barely able to speak. Her words were shaky but clear enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. She was being attacked by a stranger. She didn't know exactly where she was, only that it was somewhere between Gidong Elementary School and Moga Park. Then came the sound of a door being kicked open. On the other end of the call, officers heard her scream, "I'm sorry. Please, I'm sorry." And then, everything went quiet. That call should have triggered immediate action, but it didn't. At the time, Korea's emergency system didn't support real-time GPS tracking. The police could only trace the registered address of the phone number, which led them to an old listing in another city. It took precious minutes, too many, to realize the victim no longer lived there. She had moved to Suwon. Still, more time was wasted transferring the information to the proper department. It wasn't until 12:55 a.m., almost 2 hours after the first call, that the Suwon police officially received the report and began to act. But by then, it was already late. They had no coordinates, no visuals, no confirmed location, just a rough idea of where she might be. Officers were dispatched to search the area, but in reality, they were walking blind. With every minute that passed, the silence on the other end of that call grew louder. A call for help had been made, but no one had arrived in time to answer it. Nearly 2 hours had passed since the chilling emergency call. Time was bleeding away, minute by minute, while confusion swirled between police stations like a storm cloud with no center. The call had been mistakenly routed to the wrong precinct, Gunsan, based on outdated phone registration. It wasn't until officers there contacted Woo's family that they discovered she had moved to Suwon. Only then did they notify Suwon Central Police, and by that point, the clock was already far ahead. At 12:55 a.m., long after the call ended in haunting silence, the first official search team was finally dispatched. But by then, hope had already begun to slip into the shadows. The officers didn't have GPS coordinates or a visual on the area. All they had was a vague mention, somewhere between an elementary school and a park. No building number, no street name, no exact point to begin. And so they wandered. Like ghosts through empty streets, they walked past silent houses and shuttered shops, pressing their hands to doors and windows, hoping to hear something unusual, anything that would break the silence. But the houses stayed still, and the night stayed quiet. The search was slow, frustrating, and painfully aimless. What should have been a race to save a life had turned into a quiet walk through uncertainty. In desperation, Wu's sister joined the search herself, bringing a photo of her missing sister to show strangers, clinging to the hope that someone might have seen her. She moved alongside officers through the cold air and dark streets, searching the same unfamiliar ground, again and again. But no one seemed to know anything. No one had seen Wu. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just surround you, it gets inside you. The neighborhood, though familiar to some, felt distant and eerie under the weight of what might be hiding behind closed doors. Somewhere, just blocks away, Wu was still in that house. She was still alive. And while officers walked in circles and her sister begged for answers, every second was quietly slipping through their fingers. Morning was breaking, but hope had long faded into fog. After hours of searching through dark alleys and locked gates, officers still had no clue where Wu had gone. Then, around 11 a.m., nearly 12 hours after her desperate call, a small piece of information cracked open the silence. A local shop owner, weary from lack of sleep, casually mentioned something strange. He had spent the night at his paint shop and complained that he couldn't sleep because of a couple loudly arguing in the apartment next door. He wasn't sure what it was about, but the yelling and crying had gone on for hours. He thought maybe police should check it out. The officers followed his lead. Next to the shop was a narrow iron gate. It led into a residential building, old and quiet. The paint shop owner pointed to a ground floor unit. "That's where the noise came from," he said. A man's voice. A woman sobbing, apologizing. "I haven't seen anyone come out all morning." The officers knocked. Nothing. They knocked again, louder this time. Still no response. But something didn't feel right. The shop owner insisted. He was sure the voices came from that exact apartment. The words still echoed in his head. "I'm sorry. Please, I'm sorry." The officers gave one last warning. Then the door creaked open. A man stood there. Middle-aged, average height, calm expression. His face showed no panic, no confusion, just a flat stillness that sent chills down their spines. But behind him, something was wrong. Something in the air. A thick, Metallic scent slipped through the open doorway. Blood. Heavy and undeniable, they pushed past him into the small apartment. The entrance led straight into the kitchen, narrow and plain. To the right was a bathroom, and beyond that, a dimly lit bedroom. But all eyes fell to the center of that room. On the floor was a large bundle wrapped in white cloth, and around it, 3 black plastic bags. The smell was suffocating now. The silence, too loud to ignore. With a deep breath, one officer peeled back the cloth, and the nightmare truly began. Inside the small, dim apartment, time seemed to stop. The officers moved slowly, as if every step carried the weight of something they didn't want to discover. The air was thick, damp with an iron scent that clung to the walls and burned in the back of the throat. That smell, the unmistakable, sickening odor of blood, was everywhere, but nothing could prepare them for what they were about to see. In the center of the bedroom, wrapped in a large white cloth, was a body, or what was left of one. The cloth was soaked through, stained dark in uneven patches. Next to it were 3 large black plastic bags, carefully sealed, as if someone had taken time, too much time, to prepare them. When the cloth was pulled back, silence filled the room like a scream frozen in air. The body had been meticulously dismantled, broken down into pieces, not a few, not dozens, but 280 separate parts. And yet, miraculously, or perhaps hauntingly, the face was untouched. Her expression was blank, frozen in time, as if trying to speak from beyond, begging someone to listen to the call she had made just hours earlier. It didn't take long for the officers to realize who she was. The woman lying before them, in pieces yet still somehow present, was Wu, the same woman who had called them at 10:50 p.m. the night before. The one whose voice had cried out for help. The one who had begged, pleaded, and whispered into the phone, only for her words to disappear into the system's void. She had been just minutes away, just behind that metal gate, just beyond a door that no one had opened in time. The man who had answered the door, calm, expressionless, was immediately restrained. He didn't resist. He didn't shout or deny anything. He didn't even ask why. His face was unreadable, like a page someone had tried to tear out of a book. The officers asked his name. He told them. His name was Oh Won-chun. For a brief moment, the investigators considered whether this might have been an act of madness, a sudden outburst, a crime of passion or desperation. Maybe it was a mental break, a one-time horror committed in a moment of chaos. But as they looked around the room, it didn't feel like chaos. It felt organized. Cold. Calculated. The body had been handled in a way that suggested not panic, but method. The black bags weren't thrown together, they were packed with care. The cuts, though gruesome, were clean. It didn't feel like rage. It felt like routine. And yet, this man, Oh Won-chun, stood silently as officers placed him in handcuffs. No questions. No protest. He was taken into custody without a word, his eyes blank, as if everything had already ended long before they arrived. Outside, the world kept turning. The sun was now high in the sky. People were on their way to work, shops opening, children preparing for school. No one knew that just meters away from ordinary life, a silent apartment held the remains of a woman who had tried to escape her fate, with a phone call that came too late. At first glance, Oh Won-chun didn't seem like a man capable of such horror. He was 42 years old, a quiet, unassuming laborer who had come to South Korea years earlier on a work visa. Born in Inner Mongolia, China, he was of Korean descent, a fact that allowed him to blend in seamlessly with Korean society, at least on the surface. To his co-workers, he was reserved but polite, often described as someone who kept to himself. He didn't drink heavily, didn't cause trouble, and was even known for generously paying the bill whenever they went out for dinner. He wasn't loud, he wasn't aggressive. If anything, he was forgettable, and maybe that's what made everything so chilling. Neighbors never heard anything unusual from his apartment. His daily routine was simple: go to work at a construction site, come home, eat quietly, watch TV, and sleep. Nothing about him stood out. He had no known history of violence, no prior arrests, no mental health diagnosis. To the people around him, Oh Won-chun was just another hard-working immigrant trying to make a living. But the deeper investigators looked, the more they began to see the cracks. Although he had a steady income from construction work, a significant portion of his salary, nearly a fifth, was spent on adult entertainment services. He admitted during interrogation that he had become addicted to explicit content, watching it multiple times a day on his phone. He also confessed to frequently paying for physical encounters, treating them almost like a habit, something routine. Over time, this obsession seemed to grow into something darker. His view of women had become warped, transactional, detached, and disturbingly mechanical. When questioned, Won-chun didn't deny what he had done. He admitted everything almost too easily. He described the night in detail, as if he had rehearsed the story. According to his version, he had stepped outside for a walk after dinner and happened to bump into Woo on the street. He claimed she became hostile, yelled at him, and accused him of being inappropriate. Embarrassed and fearful of attention, he said he invited her inside to calm the situation. But then, he claimed, she demanded money, 2,000,000 won, for her silence. That, he said, pushed him over the edge. To the officers, the story sounded rehearsed, strangely convenient. Something didn't feel right. There were too many gaps, too many parts that didn't match what they were starting to uncover. For one, it made little sense that Woo, who had no known history of confrontation, would suddenly act so aggressively toward a stranger. Her family insisted she was soft-spoken, respectful, and had no reason to pick a fight with anyone. Even more troubling was how calmly he described the events. There was no remorse in his tone, no emotion in his face. It was as if he were describing someone else's actions, not his own. He offered apologies, but they sounded hollow, like words spoken from a script. The officers listening to him began to wonder, was this really a crime of impulse, as he claimed, or had something darker been building under his quiet surface all along? What disturbed them most wasn't just what he had done, but how completely disconnected from it he seemed to be. To the police, Oh Won-chun's story sounded convenient, maybe too convenient. But to the family of Woo, it sounded completely impossible. Her father, devastated yet determined, spoke firmly. My daughter would never behave like that. She was kind, polite, and gentle. She wouldn't curse at a stranger. She wouldn't demand money. She wouldn't step into a stranger's home. His voice didn't shake with grief, it rang with certainty. He knew his daughter. And none of what was being said about her made sense. That doubt turned into action. The family began to demand answers. They wanted more than a confession. They wanted the truth. And so, under pressure, the police began retracing Woo's last steps. It was then that they found a small but crucial clue, a security camera mounted behind Gidong Elementary School, about 50 meters from the scene of the crime. The footage wasn't clear at first, grainy and dark, but after enhancement, what emerged on screen rewrote everything. At 10:32 p.m., Woo was walking alone down a quiet street. Her pace was normal. She didn't look upset, she wasn't yelling. Then, from the shadows near a utility pole, a man suddenly stepped out. It was Oh Won-chun. There was no accidental bump, no argument, no pause. He grabbed her from behind, pulling her off the street and toward his apartment. It was calculated. Fast. Deliberate. There was no moment of misunderstanding, no time for conversation, and no chance for her to escape. The revelation was a punch to the gut, not just for Woo's family, but for everyone who had accepted Won-chun's version of events. He hadn't reacted in the heat of the moment. He had waited. He had chosen. He had followed. Suddenly, his calm demeanor didn't look like remorse. It looked like cold control. The timeline became clear. He had seen Woo before. He had noticed her routine. A factory worker, always walking home alone, wearing the same simple clothes, living a quiet life. She had no reason to fear him, and he used that to his advantage. He knew where she would be and when. He didn't wait for a fight. He waited for a chance. The police confronted Won-chun with the footage. He didn't argue. He simply stared at the screen, saying nothing. His earlier claim, that Woo had insulted him in public, that she had demanded money, was now fully exposed as fiction. Even his confession had been carefully shaped to twist the narrative, painting himself as the victim of provocation. But now, with evidence in hand, the truth spoke louder than any words he could offer. And it wasn't just the footage that told a different story. Forensic analysis began to show that the apartment had been cleaned in some places and not in others. The scene wasn't the chaos of a sudden breakdown. It was the aftermath of something done with precision. Investigators started asking a different question. Was this really his first time? Woo's younger brother, after seeing the video, broke down in tears. She didn't stand a chance, he whispered. She didn't even see it coming. And for the first time, the public started to shift their focus. This wasn't just a crime of violence. It was a betrayal, of trust, of truth, and of the systems meant to protect people like Woo. The story Oh Won-chun had built so carefully was falling apart. And behind every lie, a darker truth was waiting to be uncovered. As the facts began to surface, one detail loomed larger than the rest. A detail so haunting, it left even the most composed investigators shaken. Woo had called the police at 10:50 p.m. That much was clear. But the forensic report later revealed something devastating. Woo had not died immediately after that call. She had remained alive, trapped and terrified, for nearly 6 more hours. 6 hours. 6 hours during which she was locked inside a stranger's apartment. 6 hours during which officers wandered aimlessly just blocks away. 6 hours during which her fate still hung in the balance, and no one came. For a time, The public didn't know this. The initial police report downplayed the call entirely, stating it lasted only 15 seconds. They claimed the call had been too brief to gather useful information, and that it had ended abruptly, offering no time to trace her location. But as pressure from the family and the public mounted, the truth slipped through the cracks. First, the call length changed from 15 seconds to 1 minute 20 seconds. Then again, finally settling at 7 minutes and 36 seconds. That wasn't a glitch. That was a cover-up. 7 minutes is not a blink. It's not a whisper. It's a lifetime when someone is begging for help. During that call, Wu had told the dispatcher she had been attacked. She described being in a house across from Moga Park. She said she was with a man she didn't know. Her voice trembled, her breathing rapid, her words scattered, but her message was clear: she needed help. And yet, on the other end of the line, the operator failed to act with urgency. Instead of sending immediate help, the dispatcher repeatedly asked vague, redundant questions. Are you near Moga Park? Are you sure you've been attacked? What house are you in? Questions that made sense on paper, but not in the panic of a real emergency. Wu, panicked and unsure of her exact location, tried her best to answer, but her voice faded in and out, her fear growing. And when the noise on the line stopped, when the operator heard nothing, he made the worst mistake of all. He assumed it was nothing, probably just a couple fighting, he said to his colleague. Then, without any further attempt to verify, he hung up. The call had not dropped. He ended it. This single act of dismissal became the most damning moment in the case. A woman had used her last ounce of strength to reach out, and the system closed the door in her face. Later, when investigators reviewed the full recording, they were stunned by what they heard. Wu was clear. She said she was in a house. She pleaded for help. At one point, her voice broke completely as she cried, "Please hurry. He's breaking down the door." Then came the sound of wood splintering. Then silence. The operator never relayed the urgency to field officers. The officers who were eventually dispatched had no idea they were responding to a potential abduction. They thought it was a minor disturbance. That misunderstanding, born of incompetence, misjudgment, and apathy, cost Wu her life. If they had acted quickly, she might have been found. The apartment was just 600 meters from the police station. A short walk. A 2-minute drive. She had been alive until at least 5 a.m. There had been time. But time without action means nothing. Time wasted in miscommunication, in indifference, becomes something cruel. It becomes regret. And in Wu's case, it became the bitter truth. She didn't die because she was unreachable. She died because no one reached for her in time. When the public learned the full story, outrage didn't come in waves. It exploded like a storm. At first, it was a trickle of disbelief. But as more facts emerged, the 7-minute call, the failed response, the cover-up, anger swept through every corner of South Korea. News outlets ran constant updates. Talk shows analyzed every decision made that night. Social media turned into a battlefield, filled with fury, grief, and demands for justice. People weren't just angry at Ho Won-chun. He was already behind bars, and the horror of his crime was undeniable. But now the spotlight shifted to another target, the very system that was supposed to protect Wu, and failed her at every turn. The dispatcher who hung up. The officers who wandered the neighborhood without urgency. The leadership that took hours to coordinate a response. It was no longer just a story of one man's evil. It had become a story of institutional failure. Under immense pressure, the National Police Agency was forced to respond. The chief of police, Seo Chun-ho, stood before cameras and issued a public apology. He bowed deeply, acknowledging that serious mistakes had been made. But the apology felt too late, too rehearsed. It didn't ease the public's pain, it fueled it. And so, just days later, he did what the nation demanded. He resigned. But even that wasn't enough. Investigations were launched into the actions of every officer involved. 11 members of law enforcement, dispatchers, patrol officers, even mid-level commanders, were officially disciplined. Some were suspended. Others were demoted. A few were reassigned quietly, their names never revealed to the public. Still, the people demanded more. They wanted names. They wanted accountability. They wanted change. And most of all, they wanted the truth. The Wu family, still deep in mourning, stood at the center of this firestorm. With tears in their eyes and voices shaking from exhaustion, they made one clear demand: release the full recording of the emergency call. They believed that hearing Wu's voice, in her final plea for help, would reveal the truth about what really happened during those crucial minutes. The police refused. They cited privacy laws. They said the content was too disturbing. But few believed that. Most saw it as yet another attempt to control the narrative and hide their own mistakes. The police changed their story multiple times. First, they said the call lasted 15 seconds, then 1 minute, then 7. They said they hadn't realized the seriousness. Then they claimed technical errors had delayed the dispatch. Then they blamed the dispatcher's lack of experience. But with every shift in the story, public trust eroded further. Each contradiction felt like another betrayal. Under growing pressure, the police finally released a short excerpt from the call, 1 minute and 20 seconds long. It was enough to break hearts across the country. In that short clip, Wu's fear was palpable. Her voice was weak but clear. She begged for help, saying she was trapped in a house with a stranger. The dispatcher, rather than calming her or reassuring her, sounded distracted, asking the same questions over and over, failing to grasp the urgency. And then, suddenly, the sound of crashing, followed by silence. After hearing it, the nation erupted once again. If this was just a fragment, what else had been cut? What more had they ignored? Why had it taken this long for the truth to come out? The outrage wasn't just digital, it spilled into the streets. Protests formed outside police stations. Students held candlelight vigils. Women's rights groups condemned this systemic disregard for female victims. And everywhere, one question echoed louder than the rest. If Wu had been heard the first time, would she still be alive? In the aftermath, trust in law enforcement hit historic lows. But this wasn't just about one tragic death. It was about the promise every citizen believes in, that when you call for help, someone will answer. And in Wu's case, that promise had been broken, not by one person, but by a system too slow, too unsure, and too afraid to admit its own flaws. The courtroom was filled with silence when the sentence was announced. Oh Won-chun, the man whose calm exterior had masked such unspeakable cruelty, had been found guilty. The charges were heavy: abduction, murder, desecration of a body. The details of the crime had been presented to the court in full, meticulously, painfully, without embellishment. No one in the room had any doubts about what had happened. And so, the judge declared what many considered inevitable, the death penalty. But justice, it turned out, was not so simple. Not long after the sentence was handed down, Oh Won-chun appealed, and in a move that stunned the public and devastated the Wu family, the appellate court decided to commute his death sentence to life imprisonment. Their reasoning was legal, clinical. It was his first known offense. There was not enough evidence to confirm that he had committed other crimes. The horrific nature of the killing, while undeniable, was not deemed enough to justify execution under the current standards of the law. To Wu's family, that decision felt like betrayal all over again. They didn't want vengeance, they wanted answers. But instead of clarity, they were left with silence, contradictions, and questions that no one seemed willing to answer. From the beginning, certain pieces of the case had never quite fit. Forensics had uncovered small bone fragments, 11 in total, found in the apartment's bathroom drain. At first, it was assumed they belonged to Wu, but testing revealed something else entirely. They were not human remains. They were a mix of animal bones, pig, chicken, and possibly other small mammals. Why were they there? What had he been doing? And most importantly, why try to hide them? There was also the matter of the precision. The way Wu's body had been handled was not chaotic, not rushed. It had been methodical. Clean cuts, even spacing, deliberate separation. This didn't look like the work of someone acting in blind panic. It looked practiced. Too practiced. That led to rumors. Whispers in the media, speculation among investigators. Was it possible this wasn't his first time? Could he have committed similar acts elsewhere, perhaps even before arriving in South Korea? The possibility of past crimes, particularly in China where he had previously lived, began to circulate, but no evidence emerged. No missing persons linked to him, no official reports. Just silence. The Wu family believed he hadn't acted alone. There were inconsistencies in the timeline, moments where he claimed to be doing one thing, yet surveillance footage or digital traces suggested otherwise. Had someone helped him? Had someone coached him? And what about the claims, circulating online and fueled by tabloid headlines, that he might have been involved in organ trafficking, or worse? Those theories gained traction when journalists noted the strange precision in how the body was dismantled, not just to hide it, but almost as if it were being separated for a purpose. But again, without evidence, the courts had to dismiss these ideas as speculation. To the Wu family, that felt like the system once again refusing to look deeper. They questioned why the trial had been concluded so quickly. Why hadn't more forensic experts been brought in? Why weren't the international agencies contacted to look into Oh Won-chun's history abroad? Was it convenience? Lack of resources? Or was there something being quietly avoided? Even the motive remained blurry. His original story, about being insulted and reacting in anger, had been disproven. But no new motive had ever been clearly established. Did he target Wu randomly? Had he followed her? Had he planned this for weeks? Months? The lack of answers became a weight the family carried long after the trial ended. And then there was Oh Won-chun himself. Even behind bars, he offered no clarity. During sentencing, he bowed his head and whispered, "I'm sorry." But to many, it felt like theater. A man who had shown no remorse now playing a role, carefully scripted. In prison, some said he stayed quiet. Others claimed he repeated apologies daily, like a ritual. But one thing was clear, he never told the full truth, and maybe he never would. The sound of her voice, shaking, desperate, pleading through a 7-minute emergency call, would become the echo that awakened a nation. In life, Quak Eun Xu was a young woman with dreams, with pain, and with a story the world might have never heard. In death, she became the catalyst of a transformation that South Korea never knew it needed, until it was too late. The tragedy shook the foundations of public trust in law enforcement. News anchors couldn't even finish reading the transcript of her emergency call without pausing. Citizens cried in rage and disbelief. How could a cry for help so direct, so long, go unanswered? The question burned, and the nation demanded answers. What followed was not just an apology, it was a reckoning. South Korea initiated a full-scale reform of its emergency call system, starting with its very core, the 112 hotline. For decades, this lifeline had operated with rigid rules and outdated limitations, often requiring a victim to explain their situation in detail before action could be taken. Quak's case exposed the fatal flaw in this logic. So the system changed. Now, when an emergency call is made, even if the caller cannot speak or explain clearly, authorities are permitted to trace and locate the caller without delay. No more waiting. No more bureaucratic hesitation. The chilling silence on the other end of the line is now enough to justify intervention. But it didn't stop there. The reform dug deeper. Emergency dispatchers, once trained to simply log calls and transfer, are now trained in trauma response, active listening, and real-time threat assessment. A new wave of operators entered the system, empathetic, alert, and empowered. They were no longer just voices behind a desk. They became guardians in moments of crisis. Legal amendments soon followed. Lawmakers passed what became known as the Quak Eun Xu Reform Bill, a set of legislative changes allowing broader intervention rights for first responders. The law that once held officers back from acting swiftly, now pushed them forward. But behind every clause and every statute, there was one name, one voice, one woman. Still, even as change took root, a bitter truth remained: none of it could bring her back. The price of progress was her life. Her blood was spilled not only by the hands of a criminal, but by a system that failed to hear her until it was too late. For many, that guilt will never fade, and it shouldn't, because it is a reminder that reform often blooms from pain. Today, young dispatchers begin their training by listening to the final recording of Quak Eun Xu, not as a scare tactic, but as a call to purpose. Her voice, a trembling whisper in the dark, is now the first lesson they learn. It teaches them that silence can be a scream, and that hesitation can kill. In the end, she was not just a victim, she became the spark that lit a fire of change. She was one voice, ignored in her final hour, but now heard by millions. And in that haunting echo, South Korea remembered something vital. Sometimes, the loudest revolutions begin with the quietest cries. On the night of April 1, 2012, the streets of Suwon, South Korea were quiet, as if